Donald Trump's presidency has had a major impact on how the world sees the United States. Trump and many of his key policies are broadly unpopular around the globe and ratings for the US have declined steeply in many nations. Trump's most negative assessment is in Belgium, where only 9% say they have confidence in the US president to do the right thing in world affairs. His highest rating is in Japan. Still, just 1/4 of Japanese express confidence in Trump. This stands in contrast to the final years of Barack Obama's presidency, when 64% of those surveyed expressed confidence in Obama's ability to direct America's role in the world. Part of the decline over the past year is linked to how the US has handled the coronavirus pandemic. Can it be demonstrated that this low standing in the world has a significant and tangible impact on US foreign policy? We are about to learn. Our presenter today is Richard Wike. He is Director of Global Attitudes Research at Pew Research Center. Pew is a nonpartisan fact tank that informs the public about issues, attitudes, and trends shaping the world. Pew conducts public opinion polling, demographic research, content analysis, and other data-driven social science research. Pew does not make policy decisions. Dr. Wike received his doctorate in political science from Emory University. Before joining Pew Research Center, he was a senior associate for international and corporate clients in Greenberg, Quinlan, Rosner Research. Richard conducts research and writes about international public opinion on a variety of topics, such as America's global image, the rise of China, democracy, and globalization. He is an author of numerous Pew Research Center reports, including United States image suffers as publics around the world question Trump's leadership. Another research paper that he wrote or was involved in, Europeans more favorable towards European Union after the United Kingdom votes to leave Europe. And also involved in a topic which often comes up in our foreign affairs discussions. Chinese public sees more powerful role in the world, that is more powerful for China, and names US as the top threat. Welcome to those of you who have just joined us. Now over to you, Dr. Wike.
Great. Well, thank you so much. And thanks for the opportunity to be here with all of you today. Really appreciate the chance to talk with you about some of the international survey work that we do at the Pew Research Center. And in particular, happy to talk about this topic. What do international publics think of the United States? This is a subject that we've been looking at now for almost 2 decades at the Pew Research Center. And we do a lot of different topics in our work. But as far as the international topics go, this is the one that's probably gotten the most attention for us over time, among policymakers and journalists and average citizens. And I think one of the reasons why it's always been a topic that's gotten a lot of interest is that it's just been a really interesting story over the last 2 decades. So we've seen a lot of ups and downs, we've seen a lot of changes, and we again see a lot of changes in this year's survey. So what I'll do maybe is walk through some of the highlights from the survey we just conducted a couple of months ago and share a few PowerPoint slides with you, which show those findings. And then, of course, we'll be happy to take any questions that you have after that. So let me pull up my slides and share those with you. Oh, sorry. Go back a few here, get it in the right spot. There we go. Great. Hopefully everybody can see those just fine. And like I said, I'll walk through some of the key findings for you from the study. We just put out a report on this topic back a couple weeks ago in mid-September. And before I do that, though, let me tell you just a little bit more about the Pew Research Center and who we are and what we do. We get most of our funding from the Pew Charitable Trust, so that's where the name comes from. We do get support from other foundations and things like that as well. So, for example, the Gates Foundation has funded some of our research in recent years in sub-Saharan Africa. Most of the money comes from the Pew Charitable Trust. We are a nonprofit, and we're nonpartisan, we're non-advocacy. We like to actually call ourselves a fact tank rather than a think tank. That kind of represents the fact that we put a lot of emphasis on data, empirical research, facts. And as was said earlier, we don't make policy recommendations. So that makes us a little bit different from think tanks that you may be familiar with in Washington and elsewhere, who really focus a lot on policy recommendations. We sort of stay away from that. We do the research, put it out there for public consumption, and then we kind of rely on others to take it to that next stage and make the policy recommendations. And we really stay focused on the research part. Here's some of our core values as an organization. You can see things like accuracy and rigor here, obviously, very important for an organization like ours. Transparency, something that's really important in the polling world. Being transparent about the question wording you use, being transparent about the methodology you use. So those are the kind of things that you can find more about, for instance, on our website. If you really want to dig into the methodological details of what we do, that kind of information is available on our website. And of course, if you have questions today, I'm happy to talk more about how we go about doing this kind of work around the world. Just real quickly, here are some of the research programs we have at the center. We have a team that focuses on U.S. politics. As you might imagine, they're really busy right now and will be for the next few weeks. We have a program that looks at journalism, social and demographic trends, religion, technology, science, a new program that's going to look at race and ethnicity in the United States. We have some of the best research methodologists around at the center. We also have a relatively new program that looks at big data and computational social science and those kind of things. And then here's the part that I direct, the Global Attitudes and Trends program at Pew, which studies public opinion around the world on a variety of different topics, a lot on sort of geopolitical issues, as well as we do a lot of research on things like views about democracy and the rise of populism and a whole set of issues around those things. So most of what I'm going to talk to you about today is from a survey that we conducted in 13 countries around the world from June to August of this year. Now, these are all nationally representative samples. So what that means is that the demographic profile of our sample looks very much like the demographic profile of a country's adult population in terms of age and gender and religion and geography and things like that. And you can see the margin of error there, pretty typical for these kind of surveys. I should mention that we'd actually planned to do the largest survey that we have ever done at the center in 2020. It was going to be 50 countries from all around the world. And we were really excited about it because it was going to allow us to go into parts of Latin America and Africa and the Middle East and Asia that we don't always get a chance to go to. And unfortunately, then the pandemic struck, and that created real challenges for us because in most countries where we do our work, we actually do face-to-face interviews in people's homes. And of course, that's not easy to do during a global pandemic. So we had to change our plans. And we ended up doing this, somewhat smaller survey in countries where we can do telephone surveys. So that's what all of these are. This is all based on telephone survey data. So it's not a truly sort of global scale survey, but it is a group of countries that I think are really interesting and important, especially for a topic like this, because this is really a group of countries that are key American allies and partners. So I think it's really important to see what they're thinking about the United States at this moment. So I'm going to start off with two of what we really think of as our baseline measures in terms of how people around the world are thinking about the United States. One's a really simple question about the US. Do you have a favorable or unfavorable opinion of the US? And then the other is about the president. How much confidence do you have in the US president to do the right thing in world affairs? So here's just a quick look overall of what we found on these two questions. And these are median percentages across the 13 countries where we asked these questions. So across those 13 countries, just 16% say they have confidence in President Trump to do the right thing in world affairs. 83% say they lack confidence in him. So, overwhelmingly negative towards President Trump. Somewhat better for the United States, although still pretty poor reviews for the most part. Just 34% right now across these nations say they have a favorable opinion of the US. Fully 64% say they have an unfavorable opinion of the US. And both of these numbers, as we'll see more about in just a moment, are much lower than what we saw during the Obama administration. So here's that favorability question. This is the share of the public in 6 countries that we've surveyed a good bit over time who say they have a favorable view of the US. And as you can see, it's at or near an all-time low in all of these countries. So if you take the UK, for example, in this year's survey, 41% say they have a favorable opinion of the of the US. And that's the lowest we've seen going back 2 decades of doing surveys there. If you look at France, it's 31%. It's actually the same number we got back in a March 2003 survey that we conducted there and in some other countries. And that survey was conducted right on the eve of the Iraq War. So you can see in some of these countries, you see a dip in the early 2000s. That's that March 2003 survey, right before the Iraq War started, really at the height of tensions between the United States and some of its European allies in particular. And what we see is this year in France, for example, we get the same number that we got back in 2003, right at the height of sort of US-French tensions over the Iraq War. Similar kind of thing in Germany. It's 26% in this year's survey. That's very similar to the 25% we got back in that March 2003 survey. Japan, an all-time low. Canada, an all-time low. Australia, an all-time low. Now here are the results country by country for those that we surveyed this year. And as you can see, it's overwhelmingly negative in most places, although it does vary a little bit country by country. So in Italy, for example, it is down from last year, but still 45% say they have a favorable view. It's higher than we see elsewhere in Europe. The UK, even though it is at an all-time low, still higher than we see in other parts of Europe. On the other hand, in places like France and the Netherlands and Germany, Belgium, overwhelming majority say they have a negative view of the United States right now. South Korea is the exception. They're about 6 in 10 say they have a positive view of the US. That's not unusual. South Korea typically is one of the countries in our survey that gives the US some of its highest marks. Now here's this question over time in all of these countries where you see a dash mark that represents years where we didn't survey that particular country. And the 2 things I'd point you to on this slide are the column on the far right, which shows the change between 2019 and 2020. And then where we've highlighted the highest ratings we've seen over time and the lowest ratings we've seen over time with green and blue boxes. So if you look at the change from last year, in all of the countries where we have a trend from last year, this percentage of the public with a favorable view of the US has declined. It's down more than double digits in all these countries. You look at a place like Japan, it's down 27 points from last year. So significant declines in all the countries where we have trends available. If you look at those highest and lowest ratings, you can see that over time, most of the highest ratings are found during the Obama presidency. There are a few exceptions to that. We've got some US State Department data that we trend to from 1999 and 2000 In the UK and Germany, the highest ratings ever were actually during that era. In Canada, we saw the highest rating ever back in 2002, near the beginning of the Bush presidency. But for the most part, the highest ratings were found during the Obama years. If you look at the lowest ratings, in a few places, you see the lowest ratings ever were back in 2003 during a couple of surveys that we conducted in that year, again, around the start of the Iraq War. But in most places, the lowest ratings we've seen over the past 2 decades are found in this year's survey. And that's why you see all that blue in that 2020 column. Now, here's that question about confidence in President Trump. As you can see, very negative reviews for the most part for the president in these countries. As was mentioned earlier, he gets his highest ratings in Japan still. It's only 1 in 4 Japanese saying they have confidence in him to do the right thing in world affairs. And places like France and Germany, Denmark, Belgium, it's only around 1 in 10 in those countries who voice confidence in him. And if we can talk more about this later if you have questions. But in terms of what have we seen over time that drives these kind of negative attitudes towards President Trump? And what we've seen is that it's both attitudes towards some of his personal leadership characteristics, as well as attitudes towards his administration's policies. So, for example, on the kind of personal front, people have said in our surveys that they think of him as arrogant. They think of him as unqualified. They see him as dangerous and intolerant. But there's also been a lot of negativity towards many of his policies. So, for example, withdrawing from the Paris Climate Accords, pulling out of the Iran nuclear deal, pulling out of trade deals. There's also a lot of opposition to his immigration policies, making it more difficult for people to enter the United States, building the wall on the border with Mexico. Those kind of policies have been very unpopular. So in some ways, when we see the U.S. withdrawing from international agreements, when we see the U.S. putting up barriers in different ways between itself and the rest of the world, those are the kind of things that tend to drive negative attitudes towards the U.S. and towards the U.S. president. Now, here's that confidence measure over time in some Western European countries that we've surveyed pretty consistently over the years. So going back to the Bush administration, you can see that he starts off getting mostly kind of poor reviews, although in Germany, he's in positive territory back in 2001. Attitudes towards him grow more negative over the years. As I'm sure you know, there's a lot of opposition to key elements of Bush's foreign policies in Western Europe, and that drives down his ratings. He leaves office pretty unpopular. And then you can see the increase once Obama gets into office. Really high ratings for him, especially in 2009. More than 9 in 10 had confidence in him in Germany and France that year. His numbers move around a little bit over time, but still, very high ratings for him as he leaves office. And then you can see this, the dramatic sort of plunge in terms of ratings for President Trump in 2017. His numbers have moved around a little bit over the last few years, but are low again, in this year's survey. In lots of ways, Trump's ratings now, look a lot like what we saw for Bush at the end of his second term in office. I think some of the dynamics behind those numbers are a little bit different. And that's something, we can talk about. But the ratings themselves are somewhat similar between those two presidents. Now, again, here's a big table with all the confidence ratings over time for these 3 American presidents. Again, I'd point you to the change column over there on the right, which shows that in most countries where we have trends available, ratings for Trump have declined this year. They weren't especially positive in 2019, but they've declined even further in this year's survey, especially in, you look at South Korea, down nearly 30 points there, down big in Italy, down in most of the other countries where we have trends as well. And then again, we've highlighted here years in which we've seen the highest ratings for presidents in a given country and years in which we've seen the lowest ratings. So on the highest ratings, they're all found during the Obama years. In terms of lowest ratings, there are some countries, as you can see, where the lowest ratings we've seen for any American president were for George W. Bush during his second term in office. But most of the lowest ratings we've seen for any of these three presidents is found during the Trump presidency, and several of them in this year's survey. So, one of the things that we see when we ask about President Trump is that there are differences among demographic groups, ideological groups within countries. So, for instance, often you'll see men expressing more positive attitudes than women towards Trump. And you also see that Trump gets more support on the political right, and especially among supporters of right-wing populist parties in Europe. So you look at Spain, for example. Among people in Spain who say they have a favorable view of the Vox party, which is a right-wing populist party in Spain, 45% of those people also have confidence in Trump. It's just 7% in Spain among those people who don't like the Vox party. And you can see a similar pattern among supporters of the right-wing populist AfD party in Germany, similar patterns in the Netherlands and Sweden and France. If we go to the next slide, you can see the same kind of thing in Italy and Belgium, the UK, Denmark. It's worth noting that even among supporters of these right-wing populist parties, Trump doesn't get great reviews for the most part, but he consistently does get higher ratings than he does among people who don't like those right-wing populist parties in European countries. Now, Trump's not the only international leader we ask about. We also ask about Chancellor Merkel, Macron, Boris Johnson, Putin, and Xi Jinping. And these numbers here again are median percentages across all 13 countries where we asked about all these leaders. As you can see when we do that, Angela Merkel gets the highest ratings. 76% across these 13 nations say they have confidence in her to do the right thing in world affairs. And that's pretty consistent with what we've seen over the years. At least since Obama left office, she's been the most popular international leader that we've asked about. Macron also does pretty well. 64% have confidence in the French leader. Boris Johnson, views are divided pretty evenly about him, and mostly negative reviews for Putin and for Xi. Although it's worth noting that the most negative reviews among the 6 leaders that we tested are for President Trump. So, people weren't very positive about Putin or Xi, but Trump nonetheless gets the most negative ratings on the survey. And here are those 6 leaders' ratings across all the countries where we asked the question. You've seen the ratings for Trump. You can see here the ratings for Merkel, which are very positive for the most part everywhere. Italy is a bit of an exception. Only half there have confidence in her. It's worth noting that some of the countries that we left out in this year's survey, because as I said we weren't able to survey them this year, are places where Merkel gets somewhat lower ratings. So if we had more Eastern and Central European countries in the study, if we had Greece in the study, those are some nations where Merkel does get somewhat lower ratings. And it's somewhat true for Trump as well. It's worth keeping in mind that there are parts of the world where he gets better ratings. In parts of sub-Saharan Africa, for example, in India, the Philippines, those are parts of the world where ratings for Trump are somewhat higher than what we see in the countries included in this year's survey. Now, it's also true that some of the nations we left out are places where Trump gets especially low ratings. So Mexico, for example, is the country where we've seen the lowest ratings for Trump in the years that we've been able to do surveys in Mexico while he's been president. So it's a little bit of both, right? Some of the countries we left out might have been places where he get higher ratings. Some of the countries that we left out might be places where he would have gotten lower ratings. You can see the numbers for Macron here. The cross-national pattern for Macron is pretty similar often to what we see from Merkel. They tend to be rated high or low in some of the same countries, although his numbers overall tend to be lower than hers. Boris Johnson, as you can see, the UK Prime Minister, he gets mixed reviews and kind of varying reviews across the countries in the study. So Australians and Canadians tend to say they think he does the right thing in world affairs. Very different in Spain and Italy, Germany, where pretty small minorities of the population in those countries have confidence in Boris Johnson. Putin, mostly negative, although nearly 4 in 10 Italians say they have confidence in him. And then negative ratings for Xi across the board, pretty much. I should note that we also put out a report recently looking at public opinion in these same countries towards China. And what we see is actually somewhat similar to what we see for the US. Ratings for China are also at an all-time low in many of these countries. So right now, people in these nations are not very happy with either of sort of the world's leading two superpowers. Now here's a slide on German public opinion over time, just to show you that these two measures that we've been talking about, favorability of the US and confidence in the US president, tend to move kind of in parallel with one another over time, right? The how you feel about the president moves around much more dramatically, but the favorability measure tends to move almost in parallel with it. And I think that reflects the fact that how people feel about the US is strongly impacted by how they feel about the president and what the president's doing in terms of foreign policy. So you tend to see these things move around a lot together. At the same time, how you feel about the president isn't the only thing that drives how you feel about the United States. I'm sure many of you are familiar with the term soft power. There's lots of things that about the U.S. In terms of America's culture, America's way of doing business, America's political system, that are also important when people think about the United States. So, how you feel about the president and his policies is really important. It's not the only thing. And we can, again, if you have questions about that, talk about the research we've done on American soft power over time. Now, why do we see the drop in ratings for the U.S. this year? I think there are a number of things that it could be. Certainly, I think part of it is how people perceive America's response to the pandemic. You can see that here in this slide. We asked people about their own country's response to the outbreak, as well as the WHO, the EU, China, and the United States. People tend to say that their own country has done a pretty good job of dealing with the outbreak, although there are a couple exceptions we'll talk about in just a second. For the most part, people say the WHO and the EU have done a good job of dealing with the outbreak. Mostly negative reviews for China. 60% across these nations say China has done a bad job of dealing with the outbreak, but the US gets the most negative reviews on the survey. 84% across these countries say the US has done a bad job of dealing with the pandemic. And here you can see these results country by country. There's no nation in which more than 20% say the US has done a good job. You can see how people feel about their own country's responses. The UK is a little bit of an exception here. Just 46% in the UK say they've done a good job of dealing with the pandemic. When we ask this question in the United States, we actually get very similar responses. It's 45% in the US, although as you might expect, views divide sharply along partisan lines, with Republicans much more likely to say the US has done a good job of dealing with the pandemic. For the most part, the WHO and EU get good reviews, although a couple of exceptions in Japan and South Korea. China, mostly gets negative reviews for how it's dealt with the pandemic, although in Spain and Italy, you've got roughly half in those countries. You got more than 4 in 10 in some places saying it did a good job. So overall, not very good reviews for China, but not as negative as what we see for the United States. And this assessment essentially of how the U.S. has dealt with the pandemic, I think, is one of the reasons we see that big decline in America's overall image this year. Now, just one other topic I wanted to touch on, which deals with how people see both the United States and China, is a question we've been talking about for a number of years now at Pew, and asking for a number of years now at Pew. Who do people see as the world's leading economic power? We ask people this question and we give them 4 possible choices. They can say the United States, they can say China, they can say the EU, or they can say Japan. And when we do this, what we find is not many people say the EU or Japan. They tend to either name the United States or China. And in these countries that we surveyed in 2020, majorities or pluralities tend to say China is already the world's leading economic power. And this is pretty consistent over the last few years in these countries. Now, there are exceptions, South Korea and Japan. In both of those countries, you got majorities saying saying the United States is the world's leading economic power. And that tends to be somewhat consistent with what we find as well, in the sense that in China's backyard and in East Asia, Southeast Asia, there we tend to see some of the highest numbers saying that the US is actually, still the world's leading economy. It tends to be among some of America's closest allies and partners in Europe, as well as in Canada and Australia, where you see some of the biggest numbers saying China is the world's leading economy. So, of course, a lot's going on in the global economy now, with the economic downturn associated with the pandemic. So this is the kind of question we'll want to keep looking at over the years to see if it changes. So I'll leave it there. I'll just close by saying, of course, we see a lot of pretty negative findings about the U.S. in this year's survey. But I would point out, in some ways, what we've seen over the last few years is that at the same time that people might not be especially happy with the U.S., they might not be especially happy with the president or with certain aspects of his policies. It doesn't mean people have given up on the United States. I think there's signs in our data for that as well. So, for instance, there's a question we asked a couple of years ago about how people would like to see kind of the international system. Who would you like to see as the world's leading superpower in the future, the United States or China? And when we ask that question, overwhelmingly people say the United States, right? So, they haven't given up on the US. They still want to see the US play a leadership role in international affairs. And in some ways, what people don't like about the United States at the moment is that they see the US kind of stepping back from that leadership role, playing a leading role in solving international problems and things like that. So obviously this is a topic that'll be an important one for us to survey in the future. We actually have a survey that we'll be conducting in the spring of next year to revisit some of these questions. And, regardless of who wins the presidency, I think it'll be an interesting topic to keep looking at. So I'll stop there and happy to take any questions that you might have.
Thank you, Richard. I am most impressed by all those lovely statistics you put up there. Is it possible for those of us who would like to go back and see some of them again to do that?
Sure, absolutely. I can share the screen again and go back if you have questions about a particular slide.
Uh-huh. But I meant in the future when we have a little more time to think through some of these associations. But anyway, we'll be able to see them on our site, which we're videotaping now. There was two questions about process that came in. The first one was the earliest one, and that was which countries did you talk to? And of course, I guess we saw those listed on your slides, either along the sides or on the bottom. And if you look at those, certainly by far the number of countries were from Europe rather than other places in the world, with an exception of Australia and South Korea or Japan. And I wondered what you thought about the biases that would give to these statistics.
Sure, yeah, and as I said, we definitely hope to do this survey in many more countries and cover really all major regions of the world. But it just wasn't possible this year due to the pandemic. But we've done, of course, other regions in previous surveys, and we have a good sense of what we typically find in other parts of the world. So, it varies a little bit. For instance, sub-Saharan Africa is a part of the world where we regularly find some of the most positive views about the United States. And that was true back during the Bush years when, there was a kind of a rise in anti-Americanism in many regions. You didn't see that so much in sub-Saharan Africa. And, the U.S. got positive marks then, continued through the Obama years. And President Trump gets some of his more positive reviews in Africa as well when we've surveyed there over the last few years. So, that's a part of the world where it's generally fairly positive for the U.S. On the other hand, we also weren't able to survey in the Middle East this year. And that's a part of the world where we've gotten pretty consistently negative views towards the U.S. Going back to the Bush years, you didn't really see a huge improvement in ratings for the U.S. During the Obama administration in many countries in the region Same's true during the Trump year. So, if we'd have had countries like, Egypt or Jordan, Turkey, if you broaden the Middle East out a little bit and, included Pakistan, that's a country where we see some of the most negative reviews for the US traditionally. So, that's a part of the world where I think the results would have been more negative. So it varies a little bit from region to region. And I think that's what you would have seen, if we'd have been able to include more of the globe in this year's study. Nonetheless, it is true that overall, globally, we've seen a decline in ratings for the US, during the Trump year. So, it may be more intense, I think, in Europe, but the global pattern has definitely been consistent with more negative views for the US since Trump was elected.
Yes, thank you for that. The other question on process was, are your telephone interviews based on cell phones or landlines? And either way, how do you feel? Do you feel confident in how representative the phone surveys are? But the first question was about whether it's cell phones or landlines.
Yeah, well, we've got a good international methods team at Pew that works really hard to make sure we get representative samples. And where we're doing phone surveys, certainly we are calling cell phones as well as landline phones. And the mix between cell and landline phones vary a little bit from country to country, but in most places, we're doing the majority of our calls now on cell phones. And there are a couple of places, I'd have to go back and double check exactly where. I think South Korea may be one where we're now doing all of our calls on cell phones. So, as you suggest, you've got to be able to do these interviews on cell phones, or you will get a bad sample. In the United States, for example, you'd be leaving out a lot of young people who only have cell phones. Disproportionately, minority groups tend to, be missed if you don't include cell phones. So it's really important to what we do. And then, can we be confident we're contacting the right people? Essentially, there's where this notion of really having a representative sample is really important. So what we do to ensure that is we, gather statistics from the Census Bureau of various countries, or some other agency or source that has statistics on what a country's population looks like in terms of age and education and religion and urban rural breakdown and all those kind of things. And then we make sure that our sample very closely mirrors those kind of population parameters. And what you can also do is that once you've collected the data, sometimes you might need to do some statistical weighting to make sure that that's true. So again, that's what our methodology team really works hard to ensure, is that, okay, at the end of the day, we have a sample in Germany that looks like the adult German population. And in the end, we do have one that very closely sort of mirrors what that population looks like.
Well, thank you for that. The other question I have here is, did you see any thought or indication that the poor ratings for Trump have improved the ratings for Putin and Xi, for example, making them look better?
That's an interesting question. Yeah, I don't think we see evidence that that's happening in the data. We've looked a little bit at time, for instance, say, okay, as people, if they turn against the United States, does that make them more favorable towards China, for example? I don't think we see a lot of that right now. As I noted, actually, if anything, people in these countries are turning more negative towards both the US and China, more negative towards both Trump and Xi. So, that doesn't seem to be happening in the data so much. I will say that a lot of people, however, have picked up on the fact that Trump gets lower ratings than Xi and Putin, in terms of like the media, policymakers and things like that. That's the kind of statistic that they've really picked up on and talked about a lot.
Yeah, flowing that from, again, an interest in China, China's views of the world, China is viewed by the world sort of decreasing in its popularity. And one wonders whether China, realizing this, will make an effort now to put on different perfume or something to improve its ratings around the world. Do you see anything that is China worried at all about its ratings?
Yeah, I mean, of course, I'm sure there are China scholars out there that could give you more information than I can on this. But I think that the top leadership in China has talked about like the concept of soft power, right? They've said things that indicate they do care what the rest of the world thinks of China, and whether that leads to a change in policy or not, that's a pretty complicated issue. But it's one of the things we want to do actually in this survey that I mentioned we'll be conducting in the spring. We want to look more at sort of both the soft power of the United States and of China. We've done a little bit of that in the past, but I think we want to dig more deeply into it because, we want to understand more about different sort of elements of China's image, just in the way that we've done this for the United States in the past. And what is it people think? What is it people admire about China? What is it they worry about when it comes to China and things like that? So, stay tuned. I think by next summer or late spring next year, we'll have some new results, I think, to give us more details on what it is people like or don't like about both the United States and China.
Yeah, thank you.
Don?
Val, do you have a question out there?
Well, I have two things. One is, may I remind the audience that we are using Q&A to send questions to our distinguished guest. If you use chat, we're not able to do that. So please use the Q&A function in your Zoom to send stuff. The second is that although we've talked about the approval, disapproval, did any of the respondents indicate that they thought that Trump posed a danger to their own country, as opposed to they do or do not approve of what he's doing?
Yeah. There's actually a separate question we asked, which isn't in this study, but it's in another study that we do. We ask people to rate different potential threats to their country. So when we do that, when we give people a number of different things and ask them, well, how big of a threat is this to your country? When we do that, what we typically see, especially in these nations, is that climate change actually is the biggest threat. This year, second biggest threat was infectious disease, which makes sense. And we get them to rate lots of things. One of those things is essentially the United States, and it tends to be lower. We don't see the same big numbers saying, oh, I feel threatened by the United States in the way that I feel threatened by climate change. But those numbers have gone up during the Trump presidency. So it's not that overwhelming majorities necessarily are saying the U.S. is a threat to our country, but the share of the public who thinks that has gone up during the Trump years. So that it is seeing the U.S. as a threat. I think the other piece of it is sort of not seeing the U.S. as a partner, right? Especially in these countries, which are key allies and partners of the United States. What they see is the U.S. kind of backing away from agreements like the Paris Climate Accords, like the Iran nuclear deal and things like that. And that's part of the story for why they don't necessarily have a good view of the Trump administration. They're unhappy with the United States right now as they see the U.S. kind of withdrawing from these types of agreements and kind of questioning the relationship that the United States has with many of these countries.
I have a personal question for you. Later today, I'm participating in a discussion across the other side of the continent in Victoria, Canada. And the proposition that's put forward is that women leaders have handled the COVID problem a lot better than men leaders. And I wondered from what you were looking at, how COVID has influenced Trump's rating, for example. Do you have any feel for a rebuttal to that proposition, or I should support it? We're thinking now of New Zealand, for example, as a case in point where a woman leader has certainly led the way in her country and given the rest of the world some ideas. So that's a personal question that I'm throwing at you here.
Yeah, and of course, and speaking of New Zealand, I mean, she just for the weekend won re-election essentially. We actually want to ask about her on next year's survey. I mean, I guess I'd say, unfortunately, we probably don't have enough data to answer that one, right? We don't really ask about enough leaders, male and female, or to be able to say what, you know, public opinion would say about it. I mean, the one female leader we have been asking about consistently, though, I would note, you know, she gets good reviews for her kind of international leadership. You know, I do think it's interesting that Chancellor Merkel, as well as President Macron, get pretty high ratings in our survey this year. They got pretty high ratings last year. You know, it's been the trend, and you know they're often seen sort of as representing like the European ideal for the European Union, as sort of the defenders of the international order and things like that. Um, and you know they tend to get high marks, which I think reflects the fact that those ideas in Europe about the kind of European project are pretty popular. And you know the fundamental principles of the international system, things like multilateralism, international cooperation, those are popular ideas as well. The problem, and we collect a lot of data on this topic as well, is that people don't think um, you know that those ideals, when they're put into practice, always work very well. But there's still a lot of support for the European project, the European Union, for the ideas of international cooperation. And I think in lots of ways, Merkel and Macron represent those ideals, maybe, and that's why you see very high ratings for them relative to what you see for other leaders we test.
Two or three.
Wike?
Two or three of the questions that have come in have to deal with Israel, and you did not do any soundings in Israel as I looked down your list, and the questions in some ways are difficult then for you to answer, because one of the questions, for example, was, does Israel see the U.S. and Trump versus Obama and Bush, for example? How would Israel rate Trump in comparison to the other previous presidents? But I don't imagine that you have that information, but maybe you do.
Yeah, I can talk about what we found in previous years in Israel. We weren't able to do it this year, but we have surveyed Israel, over the years many times, including during the Trump presidency. And it's an interesting country because it does tend to give the U.S. some of the highest ratings that the U.S. receives. And in some surveys, the U.S. gets its highest ratings in Israel. You typically see around 8 and 10 saying they have a positive view of the U.S. and Israel. It's a very high number, and that's been pretty consistent across the Bush years, the Obama years, and the Trump years. Now, how I feel about particular American presidents has varied a bit over time, kind of going up and down depending on, for instance, what's happening in the U.S.-Israeli relationship. It was in 2017, we did a big survey. I think it was 39 nations all over the world. And Obama got better ratings than Trump in just about every country. Two exceptions were Russia, where Trump got higher ratings than Obama had, and Israel, where Trump got better ratings than Obama had. So, it's an interesting country because it does sort of look a little bit different than many other nations that we survey. And what you see in Israel as well is that there are kind of ideological differences. So, it's the Likud party, which many of you may be familiar with, that tends to give President Trump higher ratings than supporters of other parties in Israel. So anyway, that's a quick synopsis of what we found over the years in Israel, and I hope we're able to do it again in the future.
Yeah. Mal, you had something, or you disappeared. I have another question for you. Why do you think Europeans thought more highly of their own European Union after the UK voted Brexit to leave the Union? It seems like an interesting result of the Brexit vote, that they felt more confident in themselves or something along those lines.
Yeah, that kind of speaks to a little bit of a broader pattern I think we've seen, which is that, after the Brexit vote occurred, we asked different questions about the EU, and what we saw is that attitudes towards the EU did become more positive in most European countries after the Brexit vote. So we've also seen a little bit, it's varied a little bit over time, but attitudes towards NATO also went up a bit after the kind of value of the NATO alliance was challenged by Trump and things like that. So, what we see when it comes to these international institutions is, to some extent over the last few years, as they've been challenged, by something like Brexit, by some of the things that Trump has said, actually people kind of embrace it more, right? Maybe they, it doesn't mean they love everything about the EU, for example, they don't. But, since it's been challenged and it's been questioned, people actually rally around it a bit and tend to see a little bit more value in it. So I think it's been a bit of an interesting finding that we've had in our data, and other surveys in Europe have found something similar.
I was thinking of when Iraq was big news, the Americans switched from French fries to another way of referring to them. And I think French fries has gradually come back into the vernacular here. One question that's interesting, I think, as well, is if Central America and South America were included in your surveys, what's your thoughts how they would look at Trump and Merkel and these other folks?
Yeah. It's when we've done surveys in Latin America, it varies a little bit from country to country, as you might expect in Latin America. I mean, some of the same overall patterns we find elsewhere tend to be true in the region. So again, ratings for the U.S. are lower in the Trump years in Latin America than they were back during the Obama years. But you do see different patterns. Brazil, 3 Latin American countries we survey a lot tend to be Mexico, Argentina, and Brazil. In Brazil, you see somewhat more positive views towards the U.S. overall than you see in Argentina, for example. Argentina tends to be one of the countries where we see more negative ratings for the U.S. Going back for many years, at least until the financial crisis they had there now, nearly 2 decades ago, for example. Mexico, is a country where views towards the U.S. can change a lot over time. And as I said, it depending on kind of what American policies are regarding immigration and things like that. So it's been the place where, again, we've seen some of the biggest changes in views towards the U.S. in the Trump years. I think something like 95% in Mexico said they opposed the U.S. building the wall on the border with Mexico. President Trump's ratings have been in the single digits in Mexico over the last couple of years when we surveyed there, and it's been one of the places where you've seen some of the biggest declines in overall ratings for the United States. So it varies a little bit across Latin America, although the broad patterns we see there are similar to the broad patterns we see in other regions.
Yeah, you would think places like Colombia, for example, where the drug trade and American interference, as it were, in that country would give them an opinion. It might be other than, say, Brazil, whatever. One question that I have here comes and says, is there any indication that Americans in particular, the Chinese folks, would rather go towards love-in rather than military conflict? One of the thoughts often is, if at this stage of China's buildup, for example, would it not be an opening to do friendly relation types of negotiations rather than, as Obama started with his pivot towards Asia and Trump putting his ships in and around the China Sea? So that's a question that someone has asked, and his name is Edward Russell.
Yeah, so what do people want to see in terms of like the relationship with China and how do we engage China and things like that? I mean, I think that there's a question we asked, for example, we haven't done it in a little while, but whether China is an enemy or a rival or a partner or something like that. And the number of people saying that China is an enemy has typically not been that high, right? So, but they do see China as a rival in the U.S. American views towards China are at an all-time high in terms of negative views towards China right now. And, people see a variety of different potential threats from China or concerns about China, right? So they're worried about the economic relationship with China. They're worried about human rights issues in China and things like that. they're worried about the cyber threat from China. So people do have concerns. They see a lot of threats. It doesn't necessarily mean they want, a largely military, based approach to China. I think that in general, people like the idea of international cooperation. They like the idea of diplomacy. They like the idea of countries working together to solve problems. So that's a general kind of finding people have. The challenge for policymakers is to balance all that, right? People also have these real concerns. They perceive real threats, but they also do like, diplomatic and cooperative kind of solutions to problems. So, people want all those things, and how policymakers kind of balance all that can be a challenge.
Yeah, yeah.
May I ask a question, Donald?
Absolutely.
One is a methodological question: do you have any difficulty conducting surveys in China or other countries where we're having some difficulty? Not technical problems, but let's say political problems where you can't get in, or you can't get the kind of responsiveness, or you're not comfortable with responsiveness when there's some difficulty between us and another country.
That's a good question. It is getting harder to do this kind of work in certain parts of the world, and China is, maybe the most prominent example of that. I'd say normally it's not because of a country's relationship with the United States that causes the problem that we've seen. It's more about a country's own, policies and sort of the environment for things like public opinion research. So, for example, in China, we haven't surveyed China now since 2016 was the last time we did it. And before that, it had been in our surveys virtually every year. But there's some relatively new regulations about survey research there. There's an NGO law that regulates foreign NGOs and how they have to operate in China and things like that. Hopefully, I don't think it's made it impossible to do this kind of work in China, but it's made it more of a challenge. So we're, in China, for example, trying to figure out a way to do this kind of work there. And I'm optimistic at some point we will, but the overall environment for doing social science research like public opinion surveys has become more of a challenge. And there are other countries like that as well. So, it's in some places getting more difficult to do it. And that's that's a shame, because we obviously want to try to do this kind of work in as many parts of the world as we can.
Eric Seven asked the question: it appears to me that the results of the survey that you presented were entirely as one would have expected. Are there any insights that can be drawn from the survey that you would not have gotten without that?
Yeah, well, yeah, exactly. We know in part based on our own research what to expect a bit in some of these surveys regarding what people likely think of Trump and those types of things. But it's also always valuable, I think, to do the research to just, if nothing else, confirm that our hypotheses are correct. I do think that the finding this year about the coronavirus was interesting, right? I mean, maybe it's not too surprising that people in other countries thought that the United States wasn't dealing with the pandemic well, but the degree to which that's true, I thought was pretty overwhelming. It's 84%, I believe, across all these countries saying the U.S. has done a bad job. The U.S. gets significantly worse marks than China on that question. So to me, that helped us really kind of pinpoint the degree to which this crisis has had a real impact in a negative way on what people think of the United States.
One of the other questions that our board member Tyler asks is, can you predict ahead in time? Thinking of Biden, for example, Biden, who probably will make amends with NATO and some of the other Trump decisions on bailing out of the environmental world affair, and so certainly with the low levels that Trump has, Biden, it would seem to me, can only go up in standing. What do you feel anything towards the future?
Yeah, well, we at Pew, we try to stay away from making predictions and try not to do too much of that. I mean, I'll say that certainly we know a lot about what people haven't liked about the Trump era when we've seen these numbers go down, right? And a lot of it does have to do with especially in these countries we're talking about today. The U.S. withdrawing from multilateral agreements, withdrawing from international cooperation. We know from other work we've done, a lot of people in these nations and other parts of the world want to see the U.S. do more to contribute to solving global problems, right? So, if we have a change in administrations, if there's a change in policy that is along those lines, and shows more international engagement, more emphasis on international cooperation, I think that could have a big impact on what people think of the United States. We've seen attitudes towards the U.S. change before, just looking at our own surveys, right? The numbers from the Bush era to the Obama era. You did see a big shift in how the world thinks about the United States. So it certainly seems possible for attitudes to change, for ratings for the U.S. to change. But we want to go out and actually measure it and actually talk to people and make sure that's true. So that's again, no matter what happens in the election, I think that 2021 will be a really interesting year to look at views towards the United States in that kind of post-election environment.
Yeah. So it'll be interesting times, all right. So where are you going from here? In the sense of you've been talking a little bit about doing your next surveys and trying to do other openings. Then could you tell us a little bit about what's in your crystal ball, as it were?
Sure. Yeah. Of course, I've got domestic colleagues here do our U.S.-based work. We're going to be doing all sorts of work on a variety of topics, including, the election and things like that. In terms of our international work, we have a couple of things I'm excited about. We have a survey we're going to do, a sort of smaller one in the U.S., the UK, France, and Germany, looking at a whole lot of issues around politics and economics and cultural issues. And then we'll also be in the field shortly after the election. So, we'll use that as a chance to gauge sort of first reactions in some of America's most important allied nations towards the election. No matter what the outcome is, what is it people are thinking? I think that'll be really interesting, and we'll try to get the results of that out, in January. And then we'll have a bigger survey, probably about 20 countries around the world in the spring. We'll look at some of these issues again. What's the world thinking about the United States? What are we thinking about China? What do we think about the soft power of those two countries? So I think that'll be a really interesting opportunity to update some of these trends. And we'll continue looking at some of the other things we do in our work as well. We do, as I said, a lot of research around kind of democracy writ large and how people are feeling about the way democracy is working in their country. And of course, that's been a big debate, both the United States and many, many other countries over the last few years. So that's the type of issue we want to look at in more detail in our work, certainly next year and probably for the next several years.
Well, watching the debate between the vice presidents or vice presidents to be, I wondered, is there any indication if vice presidents in any way were important in the ratings of the United States, for example? I'm thinking back to the time when Cheney was pulling the younger Bush around by whatever, and he representing, as many of us saw, quite an evil approach to the world. And I just wondered whether or not vice presidents make a difference, or is there any way of gauging that?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. We've never asked about the vice president, but it wouldn't be a bad idea. Now that you mention it, I kind of wish we did have data on views about Cheney, right, during the early Bush years in particular, when he had such a high profile. So that's the kind of thing that that might be worth trying. The U.S. is probably the only country where you could ask about the sort of second most important leader, and people would actually have an opinion about them in a way, right? But people probably do pay attention to the U.S. vice president as well. So I think that would be an interesting question for us to add to the mix.
Yeah. Al, how about you?
Dr. Wike, I think many of us are comfortable with the results of your survey, but there's still that lingering question. Can you make some kind of a direct connection between the way people feel and the way governments behave? Do they negotiate more favorably or unfavorably when there are people like us or don't like us? I mean, how do you track them? What kind of methodology can you use to understand feelings versus action?
Yeah, that's a very good question. It's not the kind of thing we've spent a lot of time trying to do. How is public opinion then correlated with actions in the foreign policy arena? There are other scholars out there who I think have looked at things like, voting in the United Nations and different, try to measure it in different ways. I mean, I think it's a difficult thing to measure, but I do think that, what a lot of like political science, for example, would suggest is that, politicians and political leaders often do respond to incentives, right? And one way in which I think these kind of findings, these kind of sentiments can matter, is that they help set the incentive structure for political leaders, right? If a country's population is overwhelmingly negative towards the United States or its leaders, or a particular policy of the United States, I think it makes it more difficult for the leader of that country to work with the U.S. on that policy, right? To collaborate with that American leader. It doesn't mean they won't do it necessarily, but it's certainly a factor. And I think it makes it easier or more difficult for countries to work with us, depending on what the public opinion climate is regarding the United States. So, it's, I think, and what we've seen over the years too, is, policymakers pay a lot of attention to this kind of data, right? They themselves are interested in what people around the world are thinking about the U.S. and our actions in the world affairs. So, I think that in general, this is the kind of thing that policymakers pay attention to, and at the very least, it shapes how they deal with foreign policy, and it's one factor that influences what they might do in foreign policy.
Richard, you've been answering questions and giving us data for 3/4 of an hour or more, and you gave us a very well prepared and well presented presentation. And I appreciate, and we appreciate your joining us, and we thank you very much. And I'll pass you over to Mal, who will do the formal thanks on our behalf. And thank you very much. I'm so proud of myself having contacted you and now seeing the result of that contact. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
We've had that problem with Don before. He has this problem, a shoulder problem, and it doesn't get any better when he keeps patting himself on the back. Doesn't seem to help at all. But at any rate, thanks so much to our guest, Richard Wike, to Don, our moderator for today, to Joan Kuhn from the Chappaqua Library, Carrie Krams, Newcastle Media Arts Center, without whom none of this technology would work. And also to Don for the fact that he has helped to recruit quite a number of our speakers for this fall. If you have friends and family who would like to join us this fall, please email Joan Kuhn at jkuhn@wlsmail.org so we can add you to the list for the invitations. Until we meet again on November the 2nd, when Don will be hosting James Falk, president of the WAC, the World Affairs Council of Dallas, who will be addressing the topic, U.S. as hegemon. Until then, please be safe, be well. We look forward to seeing you soon. Thanks again to one and all.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.